Hello, everyone, and welcome back to News from Nowhere, Scotia's weekly Scottish news and politics podcast, keeping you abreast of the headlines shaping the news agenda. My name is Coll McCail. Today is Sunday, the 2nd of August, and I am in the West Highlands, so fingers crossed my connection holds up throughout today's recording. But if I drop out at any point, you know exactly where I've gone, which is into the abyss somewhere near the Applecross Peninsula. Delighted to be joined as ever by Rory Hamilton and Samuel Rafanell-Williams. Rory, how's your week been?
Fair to middling.
Classic. Sam, what about you?
I'll second that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been fine, but it's good to be here to discuss another week in news with you guys.
Yes, indeed. As ever, if you're enjoying the podcast, and we know that hundreds of you are and rely on it for your weekly dose of Scottish news, you can support us on Patreon for as little as the price of a pint or an expensive coffee a week. Just £5 goes a long way towards supporting Scotia Make Media for a better Scotland. If you're not in a financial position to do that, you can review the podcast wherever you're listening, tell a friend about our output, and subscribe to our mailing list or WhatsApp channel. The link to both of those is in the show notes. But without further ado, let's crack on with the headlines. And I'll kick us off this week with a couple of stories regarding data centres, a theme to which we've been returning quite regularly. And this week, a 500 megawatt data centre proposed metres away from the historic Hunterston Castle in Ayrshire, it has emerged, is supported by Enos Energy Limited, which is uncontroversial. What is controversial is who bankrolls that company. And it turns out that according to the Sunday Mail, Enos Energy Limited is bankrolled by a £360 billion US private equity firm, Carlyle, which is led by ex-Goldman Sachs President Harvey Schwartz, who sat on the board of a London banking startup with Peter Mandelson. That startup was slapped with a £2 million fine for misconduct just last year. So a real insight into the kinds of financial interests at play in Scotland's data centre boom, US private equity taking over Hunterston. That's my first headline. Rory, what have you got this week?
Yeah, sticking with the AI theme, I'm touching on some more international events that happened this week, as there was stock market turmoil, which really opened up the world's eye to the sort of flaky and lack of transparency over the AI economy that seems to be happening. Basically, the Chinese chip maker was floated on the Shanghai Stock Exchange, and they soared by 466%. And in the same day, basically, shares in South Korea's main share index fell by 11%, and then another 6% on Wednesday. Basically, NVIDIA, which is probably one of the most well-known AI companies, lost more than 5% on the stock market by Thursday evening, being overtaken by Apple as the world's largest listed company. So basically what this means is that the shaky foundations on which this sort of AI economy, which is everyone's being pinned up as being the next great thing, are beginning to become clear in the same way I feel that they were in around about 2007, just before we got to that tipping point of the global financial crash, although not to anticipate too much and then be proven too wrong. But moving on to you, Sam.
Yeah, very interesting development. I'm going to touch a bit on the wildfires relating to stories to do with the use of Scotland's land. Wildfires have caused apocalyptic scenes of devastation in the Scottish Highlands, according to the park bosses, as a result of 2-week-long blazes. The fires have destroyed about 10 square miles, 25 square kilometers of moorland and forestry near Abbeymoor since Wednesday, 15th of July. The RSPB Scotland said that its Loch Garten Reserve was home to 5,000 species, and that insects, reptiles, along with trees, lichens, and mosses had been killed or destroyed. They also said that the habitats will recover, but it's unknown how long that will take. The Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, and as well as dozens of volunteers, are continuing to tackle what are called hotspots, kind of in the peat and under the grass, to prevent more blazes. Back to you, Coll.
Yes, I'm going to carry on with the data centre theme and talk about a rather grisly character called the Duke of Roxburgh, who is one of the UK's largest landowners. And recently it emerged, in fact, in today's Sunday National, I believe, that the Duke of Roxburgh was personally offered a chance to speak to all sitting Scottish Borders councillors regarding a £2 billion data centre proposal in the local authority. And he was afforded that opportunity by the Chief Executive of Scottish Borders Council, who we know is not elected but rather appointed. This guy's name is David Robertson, and emails emerged to suggest that David Robertson had promised the meeting would allow the Duke to correct some of the, quote, misinformation circulating online regarding his proposal. That misinformation is, of course, the fact that the proposal is opposed overwhelmingly by local residents in the Borders. I think the petition now is in excess of 20,000 signatures opposing the development. The chief executive also said he would encourage, in particular, the planning committee of Scottish Borders Councils to attend. So I think this story, especially when twinned with the revelations in the Sunday Mail regarding the Hunterston development, really does show the extent to which our democratic structures are being subverted to ram through these hyperscale data centres. But Rory, I will pass to you.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to turn to Scotland's wind economy. It was revealed this week that the ScotWind auction, which you might remember was capped, is set to deliver £6 billion less to Scotland as spending shifts overseas. It reported in the Herald that what was meant to be a truly historic opportunity is now going to essentially just be a boon to foreign companies. Crown Estate Scotland analysis showed that £25.6 billion of the 88.6 billion expected to be spent in developing giant offshore wind projects is it's a fraction of the original projection. This comes in the same week that the Ferret has reported that China's government and an investment vehicle based in the Cayman Islands are among a group of foreign owners whose Scottish wind farms have paid out more than £1 billion to shareholders in recent years. If ever it was becoming apparent that the promises delivered by made by the ScotWind process are hollow, and that any supply chain that we might see, let alone returns on investment, is going to reach its fruition, is false, is just being backed up by the fact that even onshore wind farms are being hollowed out, and the benefits of it being shipped elsewhere. Where is our stake in these? Sam, your next piece.
Yeah, I think Commonweal, at the time that the ScotWind auction happened, called it something like the greatest act of economic malfeasance in a generation, and they have been thoroughly vindicated on that front based on these news. I'm wanted to talk about a £15 million flooding initiative launched by the Scottish Government, intended to support measures like sustainable drainage, nature-based flooding solutions, and planting designed to reduce flood risks. Coastal communities will also benefit from funding to mitigate coastal erosion and build resilience during storm surges. There's also a new flood advisory service to help local authorities deliver major flood protection schemes more efficiently, reducing delays and ideally improving value for money. We've been talking a lot about wildfires, but of course flooding is another thing that Scotland in particular is quite susceptible to because of our extensive coastlines and in our cities as well. So something to keep an eye on, and hopefully these resources can go to good use.
Thanks very much, Sam. Final story for me, and quite a grim headline, is the news that Turning Point Scotland, a social care provider which supports between 8,000 and 12,000 people at any one time, as well as disabled people and those with substance misuse issues, is set to close as a result of what Turning Point Scotland call significant rent hikes on behalf of their landlord at their Glasgow premises. That landlord is City Property, which, as we know and have spoken about before, is owned entirely by Glasgow City Council. For context, Turning Point Scotland have dealt with 3,650 referrals over the last 3 years alone. This is the kind of local government austerity that we've become used to over the last 16 years, and it is the kind of local government austerity that we are going to see much more of in the coming months. A reminder that there is a huge budget gap across Scotland when it comes to local authorities setting their budgets this year. We're talking about in excess of £500 million. In Glasgow, that figure alone is £86 million. So services like Turning Point Scotland are going to be put under a lot of pressure. Rory, what have you got finally?
Yeah, kind of sticking with the rent slash housing scheme, and also sticking with the Commonwealth theme, slightly perhaps unsurprisingly for me. This week it was found that there's a culture of secrecy after within the SNP after a Commonwealth Freedom of Information request found that the £500 million First Homes Fund, basically the internal documents were entirely redacted in the Freedom of Information request around their internal assessment as to whether the first time buyer scheme would represent value for money or any information like that. So the lack of transparency over the details on its effectiveness and any associated risks or costs were unavailable to Commonweal, who sent in the Freedom of Information request, with Craig DL saying, "We were almost certain that the First Minister announced this policy without any serious consideration just before the election, largely because they announced a housing emergency, but don't seem to have any credible plans to do anything about it." And with that, Sam, give us your last story.
Yeah, another story relating to the Scottish Government's lack of consideration announcing a policy in advance of the Scottish election. Senior doctors have said that their warnings about the Scottish Government's, the SNP's GP walk-in clinics policy, their warnings about it were ignored in the run-up to the Scottish election. Immediately after that policy was announced at SNP conference in October, medics actually condemned those proposals, warning that it was existing general practices that required the increased funding and resources, and that walk-in centres would not end the 8 a.m. rush. This comes as new figures show that existing walk-in clinics have not experienced very significant take-up from patients, the kind of take-up that would be required to ease pressure on GP surgeries.
Thanks very much, Sam. Devastating news from Rory there that the three of us are going to have to wait a little while longer on our Scottish Government-sponsored homes. That really is a stake through the heart. Moving on to more substantive stories this week, and let's start with the fact that BP has announced its intention to place its North Sea oil and gas business up for sale. This is part of a wider trend within the company, which has seen new corporate leadership attempt to cut debt levels and slim down operations. BP currently has 5 production hubs in the North Sea, 2 in the central North Sea and 3 west of Shetland, employing around 1,100 workers. Of course, this sparks very serious concerns regarding this new wave of deindustrialisation sweeping Scotland, particularly in the northeast, where we are losing up to 400 jobs every month. We've been talking about this a lot. A couple of words on this story for context before I bring Rory and Sam in. BP leaving the North Sea is, of course, historically significant because of their role in the development of the basin over the last, I suppose now, 60 years. Their role in the Forties field doesn't need to be retraced. I think they were granted the first North Sea extraction licence back in the late 60s. So there is a particularly important element of this story regarding BP's own historic significance. Andy Burnham has responded by saying he intends to be pragmatic about North Sea oil and gas extraction as Prime Minister. John Swinney, however, has been somewhat more strident. He has condemned Westminster's super tax. The energy profits levy, he says, is hurting Scotland and it must be scrapped. The GMB trade union, who represent large numbers of offshore workers, have blamed this, what they call unfolding industrial calamity, on mixed messages on oil and gas from Scotland's politicians. Sam, let's come to you first. What have you made of BP's decision?
So the big takeaway here is that North Sea oil production, from what I gather, has been declining very steadily for decades now, and that big companies are increasingly less inclined to consider North Sea kind of worth operating in compared to other areas. And it seems to me like this fact is not really registering properly, actually, in the public debate and in public announcements by leadership in Scotland and the UK about whether the UK government should help oil and gas companies continue exploiting the North Sea. So it's Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Shell, Total Energies, and a company called End, I think, which I've not heard of. They've all sold or spun off or reduced their operations in recent years as production there falls and other locations become more profitable. That's according to a report I read from Reuters. And at peak production, which I think was in the late 90s, early 2000s, North Sea, it produced 4.5 million barrels of oil a day. And today, we're just at just under 1 million per day, and it's expected to just continue declining. Now, the fossil fuel companies and their supporters will love to decry what they call a punitive tax regime for decreased corporate interest in the North Sea. But, let's remember that I find it insane that people forget about this, but the windfall tax on energy profits was implemented at a time in which companies like BP, not exclusively, but like them, were making an absolute killing during an energy crisis by rinsing people like us, right? While our energy bills skyrocketed. So the energy profits levy is not punitive. Actually, what those companies do to people like us is what's punitive as far as I'm concerned, when they exploit volatility in the energy markets to price gouge. But anyway, listen, BP's profits in the first quarter of this year more than doubled, right? After massive increases in revenues in its oil trading business as a consequence of the Iran war. So while this absurdly wealthy multinational company makes bumper profits again due to another global energy crisis, which affects all of us negatively, they're selling off operations in the North Sea, sacrificing a bunch of jobs. And for some reason, the political debate in the UK is being geared towards what our government can do to help companies like BP make more profits in the North Sea, ignoring the fact that these companies themselves see that basin as less viable business anyway. It's all very weird, honestly, from a political perspective, especially when we've had a mass casualty event due to excess deaths due to the heat, right, in this summer, half of England and the whole of Wales in drought. We've got wildfires scarifying the whole country from Scotland to Wales to Suffolk. So, I find the whole political posturing from both the SNP and Labour at the moment, from what it seems, very, very bizarre from a political perspective. I think just to finish off, there's a Greenpeace official quoted in The Guardian, which, and I think they nailed it. The quote is, "If the North Sea really were the savior of jobs, opportunity, and energy security that the fossil fuel lobby claims, its biggest beneficiaries wouldn't be heading for the exit." Which I think is quite a good way of summing up this story. Rory, handing on to you, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I might double down on a little bit on some of what you just said there, Sam. Oxfam recently released a report which said that the six fossil fuel corporations which you mentioned expect Q2 profits to nearly double Q1 profits. And 2026 profits are set to exceed the previous 21 months combined. So for me, what this should do, but I don't think will do, is separate this talk about the energy profits levy from the actual reality on the ground, and I don't see the politicians doing that, as you say. If anything, I think it really highlights how far behind political leaders are on the actual economics of oil and gas and of renewables. That they're jumping from sort of policy statement to policy statement, which is really just a reactionary rhetorical response without actually getting to grips with the depths of it, because they operate by the grid, they operate by social media, so not the electricity grid, obviously the social media grid. And if anything, I actually think that it highlights sometimes that it is useful to pay attention to what's happening in the business sector, whether we like it or not, as a sort of broadly left, and not to say anti-business, but they're not the be all and end all, or anti-market perhaps is maybe a better way of putting it. But the fact that BP themselves are positioning and they know where their economic forecasts are at, and they're saying, okay, this isn't viable for us in the future, signals that they can see the sort of finitude of fossil fuels. And I imagine that they will pivot somewhat towards renewables because it's inevitable that that's where the economy is going to go. I think it'll be slow, but the fact, and I think again, it frustrates me because it highlights what politicians themselves have been missing. Right, they've been using the crisis in Iran to talk about increased oil and gas to improve our own energy security. Let's be self-sufficient. When this surely, as another like sort of spike in the global economy, as another shock event, as you say, which seems to be becoming more frequent, whether it's climate or whether it's international conflict, they're becoming so frequent. Surely, if anything, this is highlighting the need to move to a more stable, more reliable fuel resource, such as renewables. The cost of solar, the cost of batteries has decreased. Battery production and installation has decreased at such a rate that wasn't expected, that it is now very, very cheap to do that. And now I know we don't have loads of sun here, but we can still. It's not exactly like it beams it in a portal. It's a little bit more complex than that. And we have a big mix of other renewable energy sources, which we can pivot to, such as tidal, such as wind, although we've already highlighted on this particular episode where those profits are going, right? So I think, if anything, what this is proving is that politicians have absolutely no economic direction when it comes to energy policy and energy economics specifically, and are very much being led by policy statements and failing to actually engage even with our capitalist overlords at BP. And I think that says a lot more about the state of the competency of our politicians than it does actually about BP's own motivations and projections.
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Rory, and I want to drill into some of what Sam just said regarding the context of BP's departure, because I think this is quite a significant bit of news, but the conversation regarding the North Sea is taking place in a vacuum. So the North Sea is a declining basin, and corporations like BP have long recognised that fact. In 2000, North Sea oil production was equivalent to 138 million tonnes of oil. 10 years later, that figure had halved to 69 million tonnes. There weren't windfall taxes in that time. There wasn't an energy profits levy. The SNP's explanation doesn't hold up to fact. By the 2020s, that figure was 34.1 million tonnes. So this is a long-term decline, not brought about by short-term policy decisions from Westminster, but rather by geological fact. The basin is being exhausted. We're beyond 85% of it drilled, and rather than recognise that, the SNP's choice has been to defend profiteering in a nakedly anti-intellectual electioneering pitch to voters in the Northeast, which itself is symptomatic of their own political weakness. Just as you say, Sam, oil and gas companies project record profits once again as a result of the Iran war. And where do those profits go? Well, 50% of US profits for these oil and gas companies go straight into the pockets of the 1%. 50% straight to the 1%. This is a redistribution machine for wealth in the wrong direction, and it's being defended by the Scottish National Party. And I think it's interesting to drill down into how they defend it. If you read the language of someone like Stephen Flynn, he demands that the North East workforce be protected by decision makers in London, and that is an entirely legitimate demand, but it denies the agency of Holyrood as a devolved institution to do anything about it, because ultimately this is a political failure which belongs to our entire political class, no matter where they are based. The Scottish Government's planning for a just transition has been woeful. In the time that BP have recognised the North Sea as a declining basin, successive rounds of Scottish governments have not. We know. We've traced this on this podcast for months. We talk about Scotland only 10 minutes ago, the 6 billion which disappeared in this week alone as a result of investment pledged domestically moving abroad. Until the Scottish Government have a handle on any of this stuff, Stephen Flynn's rhetoric regarding protecting workers in the North East rings entirely hollow. So I think putting this development in its broader context is critical. And Rory's right to talk about BP's investment in renewables, because who owns 5% of the Scotland auction? BP, right? So whilst this company is able to sell up its North Sea operation, it is able to move in. Having extracted profit from Scotland for the best part of half a century, is going to continue to do that via its renewables arm. And who encouraged its renewables arm to take on a share of Scottish renewable development? The Scottish National Party via the Scotland auction. It's an absurd discourse. But speaking of absurd discourses, we should move on to the Scottish Labour leadership election and talk about where things are at with that. As of today, Sunday the 2nd of August, 3 candidates have declared their intention to stand: Monica Lennon, Joe Fagan and Michael Mara. Of those, we believe that Michael Mara and Joe Fagan will make the ballot. Question marks remain over whether Monica Lennon can generate the support from parliamentarians to get on the ballot. That requires 3 MSPs and 3 MPs. There's a question meanwhile over whether Michael Mara will generate the backing among Scottish Labour Party affiliates, so that's trade unions and socialist societies. You need 3 of those again to make the ballot. The nature of the contest is such now that Monica Lennon's lack of backing among parliamentarians might mean that no women make the ballot. That and a host of factors has led Monica Lennon to say the contest reeks of misogyny and male entitlement. And I think it is worth at this point mentioning a story in the Ferret this week which highlighted some of this. Sorry, not the Ferret, the Herald, who reported the words of a senior Scottish Labour source who said, "What I'm hearing from colleagues is that there are huge swathes of Scottish Labour groups who would happily back Monica right this minute, but they are being pressured by office bearers and campaigners. They're being told to hold back on declaring who they're supporting." It's been an eventful week in Scottish Labour again as this contest unfolds. Rory, what have you made of things?
I mean, the question on my lips is one I think that STV asked this week, which really is, who cares who leads Scottish Labour? Like, I know it's a little bit droll perhaps to say, but they are a bit of an irrelevant force at the moment. Labour in Scotland is being headed up by the devolutionary agenda of Andy Burnham. There's questions around the role of the Scotland office in that setting, given Andy Burnham's desire to empower local councils, particularly around things like income tax and income tax revenue. And I think what's an important part of this, and I'll pivot to the 3 candidates at the moment, and perhaps some prospective ones too, is who's going to pick up that mantle and how much are Scottish Labour going to stick with the devolutionary agenda of Andy Burnham, or how much do they want to put a flag pole in the ground and say we are an adjacent party that focuses on Scotland's issues, which are in many cases similar to those south of the border, but we want to have some more autonomy and escape this sort of branch party title that we've been, has been hanging over our shoulders for so many years. I think one indication is the way Monica Lennon has been pitching herself. She used her slogan in her campaign slogan included the "For Us" branding that Andy Burnham used in his Makerfield campaign. And I think it's interesting. I believe that Monica has the backing of Brian Leishman and Ewan Steinbank, who are broadly, certainly Brian is on the left of the party, but Ewan Steinbank is sort of more broadly on the soft left of the party as well. And I think the naked electioneering of the rest of the Parliamentary Labour Party in Scotland is beginning to come to the fore somewhat with this. She would be the more popular candidate, but if she can't get on the ballot, the other question around who takes up the left's mantle is Katie Clark, who has supposedly been mulling a bid. Among that has been really making a pitch towards working class communities around public diners, which was something that the SNP announced that they would do. Her statement this week was that oh, I've lost it. Earlier this week, Katie Clark said, "The Scottish Labour Party needs to be consistent in what we stand for. Our party was created to fight for working class communities, and that is whose interests we must represent." She's really teeing up a potential run here, but clearly it's perhaps looking a bit shaky as to whether she might also be able to garner enough support from within the Parliamentary Labour Party in Scotland. And we also saw Paul Sweeney, another mooted leadership figure, put himself behind Joe Fagan, the South of Scotland MSP, who sort of came out of nowhere to put his name forward for the leadership. Now, I think what that says really is that, one, there is no coordinated strategy for the left for the left of the Labour Party in Scotland, and two, the decimation of the left as a group within Scottish Labour really leaves it sort of at odds and ends, trying to organise itself ahead of a leadership contest. And to be honest, I would welcome a contest which had 3 candidates rather than 2. Earlier, I think I was talking about it being straight up between Michael Mara and Monica Lennon. I would welcome the third option. I think it allows a broader discussion rather than everyone who's not on the left of the party coalescing around one. I think there opens some opportunities to split the right vote. But as ever, I think it's all fading into the background against Andy Burnham and his policy agenda. It fades into the background against the SNP, who really, I don't think this is going to even graze their shoulders as a contest. It's a sad state of affairs for Scottish Labour, and I'm afraid I think it's a poison chance for whoever comes next.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I do think that the stakes are perhaps slightly higher than the STV headline, made it seem, just because, it seems as though the candidates that are running are taking slightly a different approach in the way that they're messaging. At minimum, I'm admittedly not very familiar with the internal workings of the Scottish Labour Party, and I think that that's maybe something that I can be grateful for. But for me, it will be interesting to see to what extent Michael Mara's involvement in the most recent election will be held against him by members, since he was very involved in that campaign, and I understand he played a role in writing the manifesto, which we covered on this podcast and found very uninspiring. Certainly his pitch to, and I quote, "unite and review," end quote, the Scottish Labour Party, comes across as very technocratic, not really mapping onto the urgency of the crisis in the party, which I do think is much better recognised by the other candidates, Monica Lennon and Katie Clark, but also Joe Fagan himself said that continuity is not an option when he put his lot in. So yes, I agree with the general assessment of terminal decline for Scottish Labour, but it seems to me as if a continuity candidate is elected, then that decline will be much steeper and faster. Coll.
I think you're right, Sam. That question of who cares who leads Scottish Labour is not just a question which STV are asking. It's a question that Monica Lennon opened her Scotsman op-ed with. She wrote, "If Scottish Labour ceased to exist tomorrow, would anyone care?" And interestingly left the question open rather than providing an answer. But I suppose the indication or the invocation is that her leadership would ensure that people did care. I'm going to be brief because the only real point I want to make here is to say that this contest is unfolding without any real politics to it. It is a factional battle being waged in the absence of any broader vision for the party. To Joe Fagan's credit, I think his municipalism does provide some kind of broader vision, but certainly in the case of Mara, the continuity pitch is clear. Monica is looking towards a into factionalism within the party, but I think in terms of any of them identifying a future for the party, or indeed a base for the party extending beyond that which rewards its 17 MSPs every election, there's no real vision there. Let's move on quickly because we are tight on time to our final story of the week, and that is in fact the news that Scotland's tax affairs made the Washington Post this week. after analysis from Dan Needle, who's the tax expert who recently featured prominently in the Channel 4 Gary Stevenson documentary, found the Scottish Government's 48p tax rate cost Scotland £22 million. In other words, taxing the rich actually costs the Scottish taxpayer and doesn't work. The international press jumped for joy. His report was covered very widely, but it's not so simple, at least according to a few pieces of work which have came out subsequently. Rory and Sam, I'm going to give you each a minute on this. Rory, let's come to you first.
Oof, no small task. Look, this piece is being plumped up by a friend of the pod, Sir Tom Hunter, about the dangers of introducing taxes on the rich. I think it's essential to highlight. He's a flawed man, but Anton Muscatelli is a very respected economist. Said that we need to do more research to understand the impact of this, whether it's a blip or a trend, and that's something I would agree with. To be completely honest, the SNP, with all the powers it has, is going to really, really struggle to make loads and loads of difference when it comes to tax. And without full, I hate the term, but full fiscal autonomy, it's not going to have the transformative change that it wants. It would be interesting, given that I mentioned Andy Burnham's policies in the last segment, what he intends to do with that when it comes to Scotland, whether there's an opportunity for the Scottish Government to work with Andy Burnham around doing similar. I highly doubt it, given the SNP's sort of visceral hatred of local authorities. Whether they would be willing to pass on some of that responsibility to local authorities to be able to generate their own revenue, to be able to set local income taxes and things like that. I think that is the essential thing that should be coming out of this, not focusing on the supposed millionaire flight, which, to be honest, I think is broadly a myth anyway.
We are really going to have to wrap up before you compliment Anton Muscatelli anymore. But Sam, let's go to you.
I'll be very quick. Just to point out that as Rory McFarlane has done a response to this report that every listener should go and check out. His main point is that Needle has made the assumption that it's behavioral changes that is resulting in this decrease in revenue, whereas Rory McFarlane's pointed out there's a whole variety of different factors that could be causing this, rather than just the fact that the Scottish Government increased taxes. But very quickly, I mean, the point is made already. There's a big political problem, which is that Needle's highly qualified claim that the tax policy has cost 22 million has not been remotely qualified in that way by the media. And it's been picked up by the Times, it's been picked up by the Telegraph, it's been picked up by the Washington Post, very dramatically misreported in some instances, and even Needle himself goes to the Herald to make his case about the disease on the left regarding progressive taxation and whether it's actually worthwhile, right? So he succeeded in the media blitz. He succeeded in dialing the tone of the conversation in Scotland against progressive taxation, in favor of the Scottish Tories and in favor of the Scottish millionaires that have been calling for tax cuts. And now we're talking about what if the Scottish Government hadn't raised taxes, instead of talking about how progressive taxation can be more effective if we want a progressive tax system, which we do.
Yeah, you're quite right, Sam. Another central point that Rory has made is the fact that since the Scottish rate of income tax, top rate of income tax, diverged from the English rate, Scotland has actually attracted more top-tier taxpayers than in previous years, which is pretty essential with regards to combating Needle's broader narrative regarding capital flight, right? Which is to say that there is not necessarily, at least in the data we have to hand, which I think ends in 2023, compelling reasoning to suggest that millionaires and those earning above I think £120,000 a year are leaving the country. But we've had a great episode, good conversation as ever, guys. Thank you very much to you at home for listening, to Rory and Sam for joining me on the podcast. I apologise if there's been any issues with my connection in the recording. As I said, the West Highlands don't provide the best podcasting conditions, at least where I'm sat now. And on that, we will leave it. Support the podcast on Patreon, subscribe to our mailing list, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.